All right, so we're diving deep today, and this one is all about the Blue Nile River.
Yeah.
I was looking at this incredible photo of the Blue Nile Falls the other day, and it got me thinking, like, how much do I really know about this river? Turns out, not that much.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be looking at, like the economic impact, the environmental impact, and even the social impact of the Blue Nile.
Hmm.
And there's all this talk about the GERD and stuff. There's a lot of misconceptions floating around.
Yeah, there is a lot of misinformation out there. Understanding all those impacts that you mentioned, it's really key, not just to understanding that region, but, the bigger picture, like global water and energy.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Okay. Well, so let's start with the basics, I guess. Like geographically, where is this thing? Where does it start? Where does it go? The Blue Nile starts at Lake Tana, right?
Right, Lake Tana in Ethiopia.
In Ethiopia. Okay.
Yeah.
And then flows through Sudan and then eventually meets up with the White Nile in Egypt to form the Nile River.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an impressive journey, over 4,132 miles long. That's, longer than the entire U.S. from coast to coast.
Wow, that's crazy.
But here's something that most people don't realize. The Blue Nile contributes the majority of the Nile's water flow, somewhere between 70 and 80% during the rainy season.
Wow. Okay. I did not realize it was that much. So it's not just like some minor tributary. It's the real
It's
deal.
the powerhouse of the Nile.
Okay, that's important to remember when we're talking about, like you said, the economic impact. So what is that economic impact? I mean, we all know the Nile's important, but
It's hugely important. I mean, we're talking the Nile supports agriculture, industry, drinking water, millions of people. A staggering 95% of Egypt's population lives within 12 miles of the river.
95%, so like almost everyone. I mean, so cities like Aswan, which has a population of 357,000 people,
hmm
they're completely reliant on it.
Absolutely. And that reliance creates both opportunities and anxieties, especially with the GRE.
Right, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, yeah. That's been in the news a lot. There's so much talk about it. And frankly, a lot of misinformation too. Like there's people claiming that it'll like cripple Egypt's economy by reducing water flow. I even saw a claim that a 1 billion cubic meter reduction in flow could cost Egypt 1 million jobs. At $1.8 billion. Is that even possible?
So that's a great example of a misleading claim. While, Egypt's concerns are understandable, that particular figure kind of ignores the massive capacity of the Aswan High Dam. It can hold 162 billion cubic meters of water. So, it's designed to handle those fluctuations in flow.
So 1 billion cubic meters is a drop in the bucket compared to that.
Right. While impactful, it wouldn't have the catastrophic effects some are suggesting.
Okay, so yeah, there's a need to separate fact from fiction, I guess, when we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not just about Egypt, right? I mean, the GRD also impacts Sudan.
Of course, yeah. Studies suggest that Sudan could actually see a GDP increase up to 29 billion US dollars through increased agricultural output and hydropower generation.
Wow, that's a lot. So a win-win for Ethiopia and Sudan, potentially.
Well, it's not that simple. Sudan's gains depend heavily on, careful planning and cooperation. The types of crops they choose to cultivate, for example, are going to be key.
Right, right.
It all comes back to balancing that economic development with water security for all the nations sharing the Nile.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I was reading this travel blog, actually, about the Blue Nile Falls, and the writer was surprised to find that, like, the falls weren't actually blue. They were more, like, brown because of all the soil erosion upstream.
Right, and that's a perfect example of how unsustainable land practices have far-reaching consequences. It leads us to this major environmental challenge, the eucalyptus problem.
Eucalyptus. Well, what's wrong with eucalyptus? I love the smell.
It's a case of good intentions gone wrong. Eucalyptus was introduced to Ethiopia for fast growth, but they didn't really think about how it would impact the ecosystem. They have this toxic defense system that prevents other plants from growing.
Wow.
So they basically create these monoculture forests, which leads to increased soil erosion because there's no undergrowth to hold the soil in place.
Oh, okay, so that's why the falls were brown. And
Can seriously affect water quality and availability.
it's like a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
Unsustainable
And
land
erosion like
practices
that-
lead to erosion, which then impacts water quality, which then impacts people's lives.
It is a complex problem. It kind of highlights that interconnectedness of environmental issues with social and economic factors.
Yeah.
We can't address one without considering the others.
So what can be done about the eucalyptus? Like, do we just tear them all down?
It's not that simple. What we really need is a focus on promoting native trees, like podocarpus, for example. They're better suited to the highlands, and they actually help with water conservation.
Okay, so podocarpus, good, eucalyptus, bad.
Well, it's more nuanced than that, but yeah, it's about finding a balance, and understanding those long-term consequences.
Right. Right.
And speaking of consequences, it's important to acknowledge the role of political history. Past regimes contributed to this environmental degradation, which makes it even more challenging.
Yeah, so it's like trying to fix a leaky faucet while somebody's still turning the handle. It's a lot. There's economic anxieties, environmental challenges, legacy of political complexities. Starting to feel kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
It is a lot to unpack, it really is. But it's important to understand the full picture, right? And that brings us to the social impact of the Blue Nile, which is
Mm.
arguably the most compelling aspect of this story.
Okay, so we talked about like the economics and the environment,
Yeah.
but what about like the people whose lives are directly shaped by this river?
Right. So remember that stat about 95% of Egyptians living near the Nile?
Yeah.
Well, that proximity, it isn't just geographical, it's cultural, it's historical, even spiritual.
So for a lot of Egyptians, the Nile is more than just water. It's like a way of life.
Exactly. It's woven into the fabric of their society. And that connection makes the tensions surrounding the GRD even more understandable. Imagine if something threatened the very river that defined your culture and history.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can see how that would cause anxiety.
Huh.
But it's not just Egypt, right? I mean, the Blue Nile flows through other countries.
Of course, yeah. Think about all the communities living along the banks in Ethiopia and Sudan. Their lives are connected too.
Right. It's not just abstract concepts. We're talking about real people.
Real people with real lives.
Yeah.
And that's where the social impact of the GRD becomes especially important. Egypt claims the dam puts millions of lives at risk, but is that a genuine concern or a tactic to maintain control over the Nile?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely complicated, like a lot of different viewpoints, right?
Yeah, a lot of different perspectives.
And we've got, this Nile River Basin Commission that's supposed to help all the countries involved work together. But, I mean, is true collaboration even possible? You've got such a long history of, political tensions, competing interests, all that stuff.
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure. There's a lot of baggage to unpack, a lot of mistrust to overcome. But the very existence of the commission, it shows that everyone recognizes the old way of doing things, like unilateral actions. Decisions made in the dark. That's just not sustainable anymore.
So it's a step in the right direction, even if it's, a little messy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Okay.
it's important to remember that everything's connected. We can't talk about water security without thinking about economic development. We can't talk about environmental sustainability without factoring in, the social and political context.
Right, right. It's all intertwined. But talk is cheap, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are they actually doing? What concrete steps are they taking to, you know, address all these challenges?
So one of their main focuses is data sharing and joint scientific research. For a long time, decisions about the Nile were made based on, limited or even disputed information. The commission's working to create this shared database, a single source of truth for things like water flow, rainfall patterns, environmental indicators.
So kind of like a Nile Wikipedia
Yeah.
that everyone can access and contribute to.
Yeah, I like that, the Nile Wikipedia. And having a common set of facts that can help, de-escalate political tensions.
Yeah.
Makes it easier to make informed decisions.
Right, right. That makes sense. But even with, shared data and all that, you still have those thorny political issues and, conflicting demands on the Nile's water. So how do you even begin to navigate that?
It's a delicate balancing act. The goal is to kind of move beyond this winners and losers mentality and create a framework where all the countries benefit.
Okay.
So, recognizing those historical imbalances in water allocation while also acknowledging each country's need for, development and economic growth.
Right, because earlier we talked about how Egypt's worried that Ethiopia filling the Giordi will reduce their water supply. But Ethiopia also, has a right to develop their resources, especially considering they contribute the majority of the water. So how do you find common ground?
Well, it requires open dialogue, a willingness to compromise, and the ability to see things from multiple perspectives. The commission helps facilitate those conversations, bringing all the parties to the table to discuss their concerns, their needs, their aspirations.
Oh.
It's about finding solutions that address both the immediate need for water security and those long-term goals of sustainable development for everyone.
Right, so thinking beyond national borders.
Exactly, thinking regionally. And that's where this concept of equitable and reasonable utilization comes in. It's one of the core principles of the Cooperative Framework Agreement.
Equitable and reasonable utilization. It sounds straightforward, but I'm sure it's tricky to put into practice.
It is. It basically means moving away from the idea that one country's gain automatically means another country's loss. It's about making sure the water is used in a way that benefits all the countries, while also protecting the health of the river itself.
Okay.
And to do that, you have to consider things like population size, economic development, environmental sustainability.
So it's not just about, like, splitting the water equally.
Right, it's more nuanced than that. So, for example, one way they're trying to implement this principle is by developing joint water management plans. For specific sections of the Nile,
Okay.
these plans involve experts from all the countries working together to figure out how to allocate the water in a way that meets the needs of different sectors like agriculture, industry, domestic use, while also making sure there's enough left for the environment.
Okay. So it's about moving away from each country doing their own thing towards a more, like, holistic approach.
Exactly.
Got
And
it.
that's where another key principle of the agreement comes in, causing no significant harm.
Causing no significant harm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm seeing a theme here, like collaboration, responsibility, thinking about those long-term impacts.
Right. It's about recognizing that what one country does upstream can have a ripple effect downstream and vice versa.
Right, right.
If Ethiopia operated the GERD in a way that drastically reduced water flow to Egypt at a critical time, that would obviously cause significant harm. But on the flip side, if Egypt implemented, unsustainable irrigation practices, that would have negative consequences for all the countries upstream.
So it's a two-way street. Everybody's actions have consequences.
Exactly. And that's why the Commission emphasizes the need for transparency, information sharing, consultation on any projects or policies that could impact the Nile.
Okay.
It's about moving away from those unilateral actions towards a more cooperative approach.
This all sounds great, but let's be real. There are some serious challenges like environmental degradation, political tensions, climate change. Is the Commission really equipped to deal with all that?
It's a valid question. And there's no guarantee of success. The Commission is still relatively new and it's facing a very complex situation. But the alternative, going back to that old fragmented adversarial approach, that's just not an option.
So the Commission is a work in progress, but it's the best shot we've got.
That's a fair assessment, but it's important to remember that the Commission is just one piece of the puzzle. True sustainability, that requires action on multiple fronts, from individual citizens to governments to international organizations.
Okay, so what can, like, everyday people do, like our listener? What can they do to contribute to a healthier Blue Nile?
Well, there are many ways to get involved even if you don't live in the Nile Basin. Supporting organizations working on conservation and sustainable development in the region, that's a great start.
Okay.
Educating yourself about the challenges facing the Nile, spreading awareness among, friends and family, those things can make a difference. And for those who do live in the Nile Basin, there are even more opportunities to get involved.
Like what? What are some things people living there can do?
Well, simple things like conserving water at home, planting native trees, supporting local initiatives focused on environmental protection,
Right.
sustainable development, those things can have a real impact. It's also important to advocate for responsible land management practices and hold your elected officials accountable for making decisions that prioritize sustainability.
Okay, so it's about, individual actions, but also holding those in power accountable.
Right.
This kind of brings us back to the social impact. We talked earlier about how the GRA is seen as this potential threat to Egypt's water security. But what about the potential benefits, especially for Ethiopia?
That's a critical perspective that often gets lost in the debate. The dam represents hope for millions of Ethiopians who currently lack access to reliable electricity.
So it's about more than just, like, megawatts. It's about improving people's lives.
Exactly. Access to electricity can transform communities, it can power schools, hospitals, businesses, create opportunities for education, healthcare, economic development, all of which can help lift people out of poverty and create a brighter future.
It's like a domino effect, but in a good way this time.
Right. And one of the goals of the GRD is to actually enable Ethiopia to export electricity to neighboring countries.
Oh, wow.
This has the potential to be a real game changer for regional economic integration, fostering stability and interdependence.
It's a powerful vision.
It is.
But we can't forget about the potential downsides of big projects like this. There are concerns about displacement of communities, habitat loss, alterations to the river's ecosystem. How do we balance the need for clean energy with the need to protect the environment and the people who depend on it.
That's the challenge. The key lies in minimizing those negative impacts through careful planning, transparent decision-making, and strong environmental and social
So
safeguards.
it's not about saying no to hydropower, it's about doing it right.
Exactly. And that means engaging with local communities, making sure their voices are heard, addressing their concerns. It also means conducting thorough environmental impact assessments and implementing mitigation measures to protect biodiversity and minimize habitat loss.
It sounds like the GERD is kind of a microcosm of the larger challenges and opportunities facing the Blue Nile Basin. It's this case study and, the complexities of balancing development with sustainability, navigating those competing interests, and finding common ground in a region with this long history of division.
You've summarized it perfectly, and it's a reminder that these challenges aren't unique to the Nile. We see similar tensions playing out in river basins around the world.
Yeah, that makes you wonder, like, what can we learn from the Nile experience
Yeah.
that could be applied to other places facing these kinds of challenges?
The Nile is kind of this living laboratory for transboundary water management. It's a case study in the successes and failures of cooperation, the complexities of balancing those demands, and the importance of adopting a long-term holistic perspective. It's both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. It shows how much we can learn from each other, from our mistakes and our triumphs.
It's been eye-opening, this whole deep dive. We've explored the economic, environmental, and social impacts. We've, talked about the GERD, unpacked equitable and reasonable utilization, and we've only just scratched the surface. There's so many layers to this story, so many different perspectives. But I guess that brings us to the final and maybe most crucial question. What does the future hold for the Blue Nile?
That's the question that keeps, policymakers, scientists, and communities up at night. The Blue Nile's future is, of course, inextricably linked to these broader forces shaping our world: climate change, population growth, economic development, political dynamics, all converging in this one river basin.
Yeah, it's like all these global challenges all kind of playing out in this one place. And I'm trying to remember, but I thought I read that the Nile Basin is supposed to get hit pretty hard by climate change, like more droughts, more floods, that kind of thing.
That's right, it is. It's predicted to be one of the regions most affected.
So what does that mean for, like, the people who live there?
It's a major concern. Climate change, it's like a threat multiplier. It makes all the existing problems worse, and it creates new ones.
Okay.
Longer droughts mean less water for everything:
Hmm.
farming, industry, just basic needs. And then you've got increased flooding, which can, wipe out crops, damage infrastructure, displace people.
So it's kind of a lose-lose situation. Too little water some years, too much water other years. And in a region that's already, politically volatile, that's not good.
Exactly. It's a recipe for instability. And that's why proactive planning and cooperation are so important. We need to be thinking about climate adaptation strategies now, and those strategies need to be tailored to the specific challenges of each region.
Okay, well, let's get specific then. Like, what are some things that can be done to make the Blue Nile region more resilient to climate change?
Well, when it comes to droughts, we need to get smarter about water storage. Things like rainwater harvesting, improving irrigation efficiency, looking into new water-saving technologies.
Okay.
Those can all help communities make the most of limited resources. And then with flooding, it's all about being prepared. Early warning systems, flood-resistant infrastructure, smarter land use planning.
So basically, just got to be ready for anything.
Yeah, pretty much.
But it's not just about building dams and levees and stuff, right?
Mhm.
We also have to think about the people, like helping them adapt to a changing climate.
Absolutely, yeah. We call that social resilience. Things like strengthening social safety nets, providing access to information and resources, empowering local communities to be a part of the decision-making process.
So it's about making sure people have the tools they need to deal with all this.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have a plan for adapting to climate change, but what about, like, mitigating it? Can the Blue Nile Basin do anything to, like, reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
So this is where the GRD comes back into play. While it's important to acknowledge the potential environmental and social impacts of large dams, hydropower is still a relatively clean source of energy compared to fossil fuels.
So the GRD, despite all the controversy, could actually be a good thing for climate change.
It could contribute to global efforts, yes. By reducing Ethiopia's reliance on coal-fired power plants, for example, that could significantly lower the country's carbon footprint.
Okay.
And this kind of highlights the potential for the Blue Nile Basin to become a leader in renewable energy. Beyond hydropower, there's huge potential for solar and wind.
Yeah, that's true.
Investing in those technologies can not only reduce emissions, but also create economic opportunities, improve energy security.
It's like turning a challenge into an opportunity.
Exactly.
And speaking of challenges, we can't forget about population growth. The population of the Nile Basin is supposed to, like, double by the middle of the century.
That's right. It's going to be a lot more people needing water, food, energy.
So how do we make sure there's enough to go around?
Sustainable development is more crucial than ever. We have to find ways to meet the needs of a growing population without, you know, using up all the resources.
Okay, well, how do we do that?
Yeah.
What are some strategies for making sure everybody has what they need, even with twice as many people?
It requires a multi-pronged approach. When it comes to food, we need to focus on sustainable agriculture. Things like water-efficient irrigation, growing a variety of crops, developing drought-resistant varieties.
Okay.
On the energy front, we've talked about renewables. But we also need to think about energy conservation and efficiency,
Mm.
reducing waste, promoting responsible consumption.
So it's not just about producing more, it's about using what we have better.
Exactly.
And what about the economics? How can these countries achieve economic growth, but in a way that's sustainable and fair?
We need to move beyond the traditional models of economic growth that rely on exploiting natural resources and start thinking about, building more sustainable knowledge-based economies.
Okay, and what would that look like? Are there any specific sectors that, hold promise?
Absolutely. Tourism, for example, has huge potential. The Blue Nile Basin is a beautiful region with a rich cultural heritage. Developing the sector responsibly can create jobs, generate revenue, promote cross-cultural understanding.
Okay, what about agriculture?
Agriculture can also be done sustainably. We talked about water-efficient irrigation, but there's also a growing movement towards organic farming, agroforestry, other sustainable practices.
So it's about quality over quantity, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
And we can't talk about all this without talking about social equity. Like, economic growth that leaves people behind isn't really sustainable.
Right. It needs to be inclusive, benefit everyone. That means investing in education, healthcare, social safety nets.
So everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about climate change, population growth, economic development, social equity. But kind of hovering over all of this is the political landscape. We've talked about the tensions around the GERD, but how do these countries move beyond that and actually build the kind of cooperation they need to deal with all these things?
It's the most difficult question. The Nile River Basin Commission, despite its limitations, offers a glimmer of hope. It provides a platform for dialogue, for negotiation, for collaborative problem solving.
Okay.
And while progress may be slow and there may be setbacks, the alternative, going back to that world of unilateral actions and conflict, it's just not viable.
So the commission it's a work in progress, but it's the best hope we have.
I think so. But its success depends on a few key things. The political will of all the countries involved, transparent and inclusive decision-making processes, a genuine commitment to finding solutions that benefit everyone.
Right.
And we can't forget about the role of civil society, empowering local communities, getting young people involved, fostering a sense of shared ownership over the Blue Nile. Those are all crucial.
It's been quite a journey, this deep dive. We learned so much about the Blue Nile Basin, the ecosystems, the people, the cultures, the challenges, the opportunities. It's clear that the future of the Blue Nile is uncertain. But it's also clear that it's a future that we have the power to shape.
That's right.
The choices we make today, they're going to have consequences for generations to come.
And we started by looking at those basic facts about the Blue Nile, uncovered some of the economic and environmental tensions, and ultimately landed on what's most important, the human element. The future of the Blue Nile isn't just about water, energy, economics. It's about people. It's about finding ways to live in harmony with each other and with this incredible river.
What I'm taking away from all this is that, the challenges facing the Blue Nile, they're kind of a reflection of the challenges facing our planet as a whole. Climate change, population growth, resource scarcity. Those are global issues. But it's at the local level, in places like the Blue Nile Basin, where the real work begins.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Well, this has been amazing. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
To our listener, keep exploring this topic. Learn more about the Nile Basin Initiative. Support organizations working in the region. Stay engaged. The future of the Blue Nile depends on it. And until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.